Hi, welcome back to Is She a Prophet? This is a series where we explore the life and works of Ellen White. We are in our third video, and today we're going to talk about something that happened very early in Ellen White's ministry, and I'm talking within 6 months of her first vision, something called the Israel Dammon trial. But before we get into that, I did promise to answer questions, and we do have a pretty good question from one of the viewers. A viewer asks, what was Ellen's stance on speaking in tongues? And this is a very interesting question because it kind of segues a little bit into this video. But to answer the question directly, Ellen White was not a supporter of speaking in tongues, which is a little bit weird considering all of the alleged visions she had and the things that she saw and described. So just to quote her directly, as far as speaking in tongues, I'm going to take a quote out of the Testimonies for the Church. Some of these people that have exercised the gift of speaking in tongues, have exercises which they call gifts and say that the Lord has placed them in the church. They have an unmeaning gibberish which they call the unknown tongue, which is unknown not only by man, but by the Lord and all of heaven. Such gifts are manufactured by men and women, aided by the great deceiver. Fanaticism, false excitement, false talking in tongues, and noisy exercises have been considered gifts which God has placed in the church. Some have been deceived here. The fruits of all of this has not been good. So we have it very clearly, she is not pro speaking in tongues. It is actually of the devil, and it is nothing but fanaticism. And I think this is interesting because it's going to segue right into why we're discussing the topic of Israel Dammon. So, who is Israel Dammon and why are we talking about him? What's his importance to this? And honestly, him alone, he's not really important. The interesting part of this, though, is we're looking at it from a historical standpoint. Israel Dammon is only mentioned once in Ellen White's writings, and it is in the book Spiritual Gifts, and she's discussing her early ministry. He is a Millerite preacher that was still preaching and was actually fanatical after the Great Disappointment happened. So we discussed it last video, that there was this big disappointment. People were expecting Jesus to come back. He didn't. Okay. We're like maybe 3 months after this. Okay. We're in February. When this occurs, it's February 15th of 1845. So within 6 months of the Great Disappointment, this is occurring. Okay. And the part that makes this interesting is that this meeting is held in Maine in somebody else's house, and it's a big enough meeting and it causes enough of a ruckus to cause a concern with the citizens, and Mr. Dammon ends up being arrested for disturbing the peace. He will then appear in trial, and while this trial is about him, a substantial amount of the testimony given by the 39 witnesses at this trial most of them will discuss Ellen Harmon, which is her name before she got married to James White, as being pivotal in her role in this whole situation. So even though she's not on trial, she's not in court, she's not part of the proceedings, she gets brought up enough that we get to see a picture of what was she doing at this meeting and what was going on. And I find it very ironic that she calls speaking in tongues fanatical and not what happens here. What we're going to see is that her account of what happens is very doctored. And we're going to start seeing this pattern. We've seen it with the first vision, right? That some parts got edited out. Now we're going to see it in this, and it's going to be almost like changing the entire narrative. My belief, personally, is that by the time Ellen White writes the book Spiritual Gifts and tells the story, it's been years down the road, which that has been true. But she wants to distance herself as much as possible from what actually happened. So she's going to explain it in a very vague way, and then we're going to get into it. So without further ado, I'm going to read her account, and then we're going to discuss what actually happened, okay? So she's talking about her trip. She's been called, just a little bit of background, she's been called to travel to fight fanaticism, according to her, fight fanaticism among the Millerite people. From Exeter, Maine, we went to Atkinson. One night I was shown something that I did not understand. It was to this effect that we were to have a trial of our faith. The next day, which was the first day of the week, while I was speaking, 2 men looked into the window. We were satisfied of their object. They entered and rushed past me to Elder Dammon. The Spirit of the Lord rested on him, and his strength was taken away, and he fell to the floor helpless. The officer cried out, "In the name of the state of Maine, I lay hold of this man." 2 seized his arms and to his feet and attempted to drag him out of the room. They would move him only a few inches and then rush out of the house. The power of God was in that room, and the servants of God with their countenances lighted up with his glory made no resistance. The efforts to take Elder D were often repeated with the same effect. The men could not endure the power of God, and it was a relief to them to rush out of the house. Their number increased to 12. Still, Elder D was held by the power of God about 40 minutes, and not all the strength of these men could move him from the floor where he lay helpless. At that same moment, we all felt that Elder D must go, that God had manifested his power for his glory, and that the name of the Lord would be further glorified in suffering him to be taken from our midst. And these men took him up as easily as they would take up a child and carried him out. She says a little bit more about it, but I think this is a very interesting part to compare accounts, okay? The way this sounds, it sounds like law enforcement was called in to break up a meeting, a religious meeting, and God was just working miracles in this place, and this guy that tried to remove just could not be removed. It's a supernatural thing. And this is what Bruce Weaver thought back in the 1980s. He was a student at at Andrews University, which is an Adventist university. And so he started doing some research because he thought, well, certainly there's got to be some record of this historically, because this is crazy. Like, this story is just wild, that this supernatural thing happens and these cops keep trying to pull this guy out. And so what he's able to find is a newspaper from 1845, printed March 7th of 1845, called the Piscataquis Farmer. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. Basically, this print covers the trial, a summary of the trial of Israel Dammon and what happens. And so this is where you start finding, and this is what Mr. Weaver finds, is he finds a lot of conflicting reports regarding Ellen White's account of what happened and what actually happened. And so I want you to understand the significance of this, okay? This newspaper, the story for this paper, just about this, takes up over almost 4 pages of the newspaper of the day. You have to recognize something about history. Newspapers at the time that this was printed weren't much longer than 4 to 6 pages, because you had the classifieds, you had obituaries, a few stories, maybe some current events, and that was it. Okay, you did not have much room to put a lot of information in, so we find very significant that 4 pages out of a maximum 6-page newspaper is taken up by this seemingly little trial. This really shouldn't have taken that much space up unless it was a high-profile case. And this is where things get interesting. In this case, the state of Maine, the prosecution brings in 21 witnesses, and the defense produces 18. So this is a very interesting trial. This trial takes over 2 days to process. At the end, Israel Dammon will be charged and sentenced to 2 days in jail. He will not serve that due to some court issues with, I believe they adjourned, and I will put up here what ended up happening, but it's very interesting to note that this is what goes on. And really, these accounts, they're not so much conflicting as far as the Ellen White part. They conflict a little bit about the involvement of Israel Dammon, obviously because it's his trial, but when we talk about Ellen White and Ellen Harmon, they get very particular about what she's doing there. We can be sure that she wasn't there to combat fanaticism. Actually, she seems to be more of a part of the fanaticism. And that is the interesting part of this whole deal. So I'm going to be reading some of the witnesses' accounts of some of the crazy things that end up happening here. But I want to start with the deputy, because Ellen's talking about this whole bizarre circumstance. What are the deputies thinking? So I'm going to read Mr. Joseph Moulton. He's a sworn witness, sworn deputy in this case. Here's his account of what happened. When I went to arrest the prisoner, they shut the door against me. Finding I could not gain access to him without, I burst open the door. I went to the prisoner and took him by the hand and told him my business. A number of women jumped onto him. He clung to them and they to him. So great was the resistance that I, with 3 assailants, could not get him out. That's some serious power of God laying this guy helpless on the floor with nobody resisting, by the way. I remained in the house and sent for more help. After they arrived, we made a second attempt with the same result. I again sent for more help. After they arrived, we overpowered them and got him outdoor in custody. We were resisted by both men and women. I cannot describe the place. It was one continued shout. This is the deputy that went in and made the arrest. This is the guy who made the sworn statement. This does not paint the picture that Ellen White is painting. There's nothing supernatural going on here. Where you're going on here is a crowd. It is a ruckus. So maybe this is the fanatical side that Ellen White's trying to distance herself from. Very interesting. I'm not going to get into all of these witness statements. There's a lot of things that come out. But these are some of the contradictions that Mr. Weaver was able to point out. Interestingly enough, Ellen says that the power of God was in that room, and the servants of God with their countenances lighted up made no resistance. We just read, there was so great a resistance that he with 3 assistants could not get him out. And they had to resist both men and women. Women were hanging on to him. Very interesting, okay? If we get into the story later on and we want to read the rest of the story, and you can go back and read it, basically what Ellen says is that this lawyer volunteers his services, and the court asked him to talk about his beliefs, and basically it's this very almost romanticized this man standing for his beliefs and people questioning about his beliefs. And some of that questioning does happen. But it's interesting to see, she says that many witnesses were brought in to sustain the charge, but they were all at once broken down by the testimony of Elder Dammon. He ends up being found guilty. So they're not broken down. He is found guilty. That is a direct interesting part of this. The other thing that she says is that he was asked to give the court a synopsis of his faith. The other thing that the document says is that the court indulged him to speak. So he wanted to talk about it, and they allowed him to. It was also suggested that they sung curious hymns, and he was asked to sing one. The court allegedly asked him to sing one. According to this newspaper and the witnesses, the prisoner and his witnesses asked permission and sung as follows. So very interesting, contradicting stories that we see. Now, what ends up happening in this, because I don't want to stretch the time out too much, I would recommend that you go in and look at it. But people are described as sitting on the floor. Israel Dammon is described to be kissing other people's wives with the holy kiss. And so we think, well, what is the holy kiss? Lilton Lambert talks about it a little bit in his testimony, that he says, Miss Baker, for example, went to Mr. Dorr and said, "You have refused me before." He said that he had. They then kissed each other. She said, "That feels good," just before they went to the water to baptize. So very interesting. There doesn't seem to be a peck on the cheek. If a kiss feels good, we know there's probably something else going on there. Let's not be childish about this. But the interesting thing that Mr. Lawton says, and it's substantiated by about 4 or 5 other witnesses, is that Ellen Harmon at the time is referred to by Israel Dammon as, quote, imitation of Christ. That is almost her little stage name for what happens here. She talks about 4 or 5 revisions during this meeting. The very interesting part, and this is where it gets fanatical, is that he told a cousin, quote, imitation of Christ told her vision to a cousin of mine that she must be baptized that night or go to hell. She objected because she had once been baptized. Imitation of Christ is said to be a woman from Portland. Later on, this woman from Portland is identified as Ellen Harmon, and you guys can look through the magazine or the newspaper and find that. When they describe Ellen talking about this, Ellen tells certain people they need to get baptized, they need to go to hell, or they will go to hell. One of them is a 17-year-old girl who appears to be traumatized by this and actually wants to go home to see her mom, and she is told, well, if you cannot do that, the time is too urgent, you need to be baptized now. Keep in mind, this is around 11 p.m. when this happens on the night of February 15th. The temperature at 9 p.m. that night was 18 degrees according to the almanac. So very interesting to see that happening. A couple of other quotes here. This guy, James Ayer Jr., identifies Miss Ellen Hartman of Portland, and he talks about brothers kissing sisters, sisters kissing brothers. Let's see here, what else we got here. They do hold to kissing, and they defend that. Several people defend this by the holy kiss, so very interesting to see that. They talked about what would happen to Ellen when she would have her visions. She would lay on the floor in a trance, and then she would get up. Actually, one of the witnesses, Mr. John Gallison, offered to show the court if they wanted to see what that looked like, and the court waived it. They had no interest in seeing that, which I think is very interesting. Sister Harmon said to my wife and the girls that they did not do as she said, they would go to hell. My wife and Dammon passed across the floor on their hands and knees, and there's a lot of things about this crawling stuff, and actually Ellen White talks about in other books the fanaticism that she was allegedly fighting was people crawling on their hands and knees because the Bible says to become as little children. And so that's very comical, but it's actually what they did. There's also another report by Mr. J.W.E. Harvey that has attended the meeting several times, and when he has seen the prisoner, Mr. Dammon, on the floor with a woman between his legs. I have seen them in groups hugging and kissing one another. I once saw Elder Hall with his boots off, and women would go and kiss his feet. One girl made a smack but did not hit his foot with her lips. Hall said, quote, "He that is ashamed of me before men, him will I be ashamed of before my Father and the holy angels." End quote. She then gave his feet a multiple number of kisses. So very, very interesting how this all just seems to just go way out of line. Very fanatical things. And it's very interesting to see when Ellen White refers to this, she refers to it almost like, no, I'm not a part of that. I was distancing myself from that. I actually went to condemn that. By the looks of this and by the looks of the other testimonies, there were a few witnesses from the prosecution that were actually Isaac Dammon told them that if he was the owner of the house, he would have kicked them out. So we do know that there was a very strong anti-attitude to the opposition. So had Ellen Harmon opposed this kind of activity, she definitely would not have been the main attraction at this. Would not have gotten that much press. Press coverage from this newspaper. What did the Adventist Church do about this when they found out? Well, first thing is they don't talk about it. So actually a lot of members at church have no idea that this even happened. And so I've got the whole story attached below. You guys can read through the paper. Very interesting if you have the time. Very eye-opening. But they actually, when the Ellen White estate found out about this, they came out swinging. They have released 3 articles so far trying to disprove this. And where they hinge a lot of this on is when you look at this newspaper, when the guy talks about it, what they say is that the writer of the newspaper, by his own admission, did not include everything that was in the trial. And it's like, obviously he didn't, because there's 2 days of transcripts. He didn't have the space to do that. And the editor, the writer of this article specifically states that he didn't, but he removed all the redundant and unimportant information that would not change what had happened, would not change the story of what had happened in the trial. And you can read that on your own time. But interesting thing is you have 39 witnesses that are brought in to testify, 38 witnesses who are brought in to testify. Most of these people are God-fearing people. They've taken an oath to talk. You have law enforcement officers talking. Some of these people are lawyers in the community. So definitely, and their stories, again, the stuff concerning Ellen White and James White, it's a little iffy there, but they all agree. The really things that they don't really agree on is things like, was James White locked up in a room by himself with X or Y woman, or things like that, or was Ellen Harmon actually called Imitation of Christ at this meeting? Some people heard it, some people didn't. But the estate really goes into trying to tear that apart, and they say, this reporter was not perfect. He obviously missed stuff. But honestly, when you look at this, you can see the integrity of that. And in this article, Mr. Bruce, he really goes into this. Mr. Bruce Weaver really goes into the Ellen White estate defense and really just tears it apart and shows, hey, this is what's going on. So they really want, it's almost like when Ellen talks about this, it's almost like this great revelation, and really what we're looking at is almost like a very disorganized rabble getting together and being very, very fanatical. So very interesting stuff for sure. This took me by surprise when I first saw it, and I didn't know what to make of it. So I've actually spent a few weeks tearing into this story, trying to figure this stuff out. And I wish I had more time to go into it, because some of these testimonies is incredible. If you want a list of people to read, on page 19 of this article, read Mr. Lawton Lambert's information, Leonard Downs, Joseph Moulton, Jeremiah Green. You can also, on page 20, you can read W.M.C. Crosby, J.W.E. Harvey, T. Proctor, James Eyre Jr., who's the homeowner, Isley Osborne. On page 21, you can read John Gallison's testimony that addresses this. On page 22, you can read Leonard Downs, J.W. Harvey again being cross-examined. So there's definitely a lot of stuff. And then page 23 really gets into the explanation of this versus the Ellen White estate and their response and the way they kind of handled that. They tried to also take the stance that maybe Ellen White didn't know what she was walking into. But she did know Elder Dammon at least decently enough. I'm pretty sure she knew what she was getting into. But anyways, if you want to take a look at that, go ahead. Now that we've got this story done, it really deserved its own video. We're running out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and end this video now, and we will see you guys in the next one. The next one, we're going to be covering the early formation of the church.